Hey everybody on YouTube, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited for today's video. Today's video is going to be the first of 4 book review videos. I originally had planned to talk about the first 2 books in one video and then have separate videos for the last 2 books, but I just recorded the book review for the first book and it was already like 20 minutes long, so I didn't want to make the videos too long. So instead I'm going to chop this up into 4 separate videos to talk about the 4 books, 4 self-help books that were written by psychologists and therapists and professionals, mental health professionals, that I read throughout 2020 in the great unfucking, as I call it. my liberation process, my self-actualization work that I've been doing, unfucking my mind and my sense of self and my self-esteem from the trauma and emotional neglect and verbal and psychological abuse I suffered at the hands of my parents growing up. Before I get too deep into today's video and today's book review, I just want to apologize in case you hear any odd or annoying background noises. I have all the windows open, it's really hot, we're in late spring, early summer here in Santiago, so it's hot. Our building does not have air conditioning, our apartment. So we rely on windows and fans, and we bought a new fan this past weekend. It's running over in the other part of the apartment, but it works really well, but it's also loud, but it's too hot to turn off. I just can't. So in case you hear a buzzing sound in the background, that's what that is. I apologize. It is what it is. It's hot. So, like I was saying, the whole point of this series that I'm doing during Sagittarius season is to share some of my experiences, but also share some of the resources that I've come across that have helped me as I've begun to really dive deep into my own traumas and childhood experiences with abuse and neglect. These are resources that have helped me immensely, especially considering the fact that I don't at the moment have access to therapy or professional mental health care, really. And I know I'm not alone in this. I do recognize that professional mental health care is amazing if you can get a hold of good quality professionals, right? Life-changing, life-saving even, and that these books can actually be a great accompaniment, or they can be a great little extra support if you are already in therapy, talking with your therapist about these kind of issues. However, if you're not in therapy, I just want to be clear that these books are not a substitute for therapy, because nothing can really substitute that one-on-one kind of experience and having that third-person objective perspective, right? However, these books can be helpful even if you don't have access to a professional therapist at the moment. They can still be enlightening, they can be insightful and game-changing on their own. They're not a substitute for therapy, but they are really helpful on their own. So I just wanted to be clear about that right up front. So that being said, the first book, I feel like I have like hair sticking out. Anyway, the first book that I'm going to talk about today, the first book that I read earlier this year, is Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents: How to Heal from Distant, Rejecting, or Self-Involved Parents by Lindsay Gibson, who has a doctoral degree in psychology. And this is what, in the Kindle edition, what the cover looks like. I came across this book because I was perusing Amazon. This is a Kindle, and even though I'm not the biggest fan of Amazon for many ethical reasons, it's just the best way that I can get my hands on these books, right? So I was perusing Amazon looking for self-help books written by psychologists and people with experience in psychology and therapy. And I came across this book and I was impressed by the reviews for the book, so I decided to go ahead and download it and read it. And I already have about a decade's worth of experience of working on myself, or as I like to call it, unfucking myself, under my belt. I first had access to mental health care when I went to college, and I had a breakdown, a dark night of the soul. I ended up having to be hospitalized, and in that experience I finally had access to things like therapy and medication and all that. So I have a bit of experience under my belt. I know, because it was so overt, I know that my mother was incredibly abusive and tyrannical. However, it wasn't until I read this book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, that I realized the part my father played in the dynamic, in the family dysfunction. And so right off the bat, I can recommend this book, and I found it extremely helpful, and I found it to be a great place to start, right? Because it's a little bit more vague. It doesn't talk directly about abuse, like the word abuse doesn't appear very much. It just talks about emotionally immature parents and what that looks like and the effects that can have on the children of these emotionally immature or underdeveloped, or whatever you want to call it, people, and how that can show up in the adult child's life and how that can still impact their emotional well-being, their emotional development, their self-esteem, etc., etc. And I kind of like how the word abuse didn't really show up. I think the author does mention abuse, you know, here or there, but the book doesn't explicitly label EIPs or emotionally immature parents as abusive. And I find that I can see there's kind of two sides to this coin, right? On the one hand, it's really important to call it what it is. Abuse is abuse is abuse is abuse, right? However, by not labeling it explicitly abuse, that might actually be a great way for people who might be kind of hesitant to use that label to still look at and acknowledge and recognize that there was a problem, right? I knew, for example, that my mother and her fucked upness was explicitly abusive, and we'll get into that in my videos talking about the book about narcissistic mothers and complex PTSD. We'll get into that in the next couple of book review videos that are coming. However, I was hesitant to use the abuse label with my father, and I kind of had an idealized vision or understanding of my father, because he was sometimes a refuge for me to go to escape the tyranny and abuse of my mother. However, after reading this book, I understand that he was complicit in all of this. He was part of that family dysfunction. He himself is emotionally immature. He himself actually would sometimes blame me and use shame as a way to shut me up, because he didn't want to deal with or He didn't want to deal with my mom. And he made it pretty explicit to me that he wasn't willing to stand up to her to defend me. He would rather just check out, turn a blind eye to it, get out of the house, get busy doing something, or zone out watching TV while my mom was terrorizing us. Right? So if any of what I'm saying about my personal situation is resonating with you, this book might be a great place to start. So just really quickly, I want to talk about some of the key concepts and ideas that she goes over in this book. So for Lindsay Gibson, the emotionally immature parent is someone who is self-preoccupied, they fear emotional intimacy, they discount the feelings of others, and they have no idea what to do with their own emotions. It's just a lack of development or understanding about emotional regulation and how they have a tendency to project their negative emotions or dump them onto other people, or to be externalizers. She talks in the book about the differences between internalizers versus externalizers, and emotionally abusive or immature parents tend to be externalizers by being aggressive and trying to be domineering and use shame as a way to control and stifle the feelings and emotions of their children. The personality traits of EIPs, or emotionally immature parents, include rigid and single-mindedness, low tolerance to stress. They deny, distort, or replace reality, and that's where some gaslighting and stuff can come in. They're egocentric, they're driven by their own insecurities and anxiety. They're self-preoccupied because of a fundamental doubt about their own core worth. And a lot of, she does talk a lot about how emotionally immature parents were probably themselves abused or raised by emotionally immature people too. So this is, this can be a generational thing. They're self-referential, not self-reflective, right? They expect their child to comfort them, so there's some unhealthy role reversal going on. They have low empathy, and they're emotionally insensitive. And good Lord, is that my father? They fear the feelings of others. They're incapable or unwilling to do emotional labor, and they demand mirroring without mirroring back as parents. And so the children of emotionally immature parents, and I'm referencing Lindsay Gibson in her book, right? They can grow up feeling lonely and hollow because of insufficient empathy from their parents, and I can resonate with that. They have trouble trusting their instincts. I can resonate with that. They often lack self-confidence and expect rejection from others. I resonate with that. And they fear asking for help or making their needs known, because having needs in and of itself is seen as a sign of weakness and can be an excuse for the emotionally immature or abusive parent to attack you. And that's certainly something that my father did with me. His idea of emotional intelligence is repressing all emotion. He thinks emotions are the enemy of reason and rationality, even though he himself is pretty controlled by his emotions. He has no idea what to do with his fear or anger. He just lets it go wild, and then he projects onto his victim. He's done this to me. He thinks that having emotional needs is a sign of weakness. He fears the emotions of others. He gets worked up whenever someone else is worked up, and he has no idea how to empathize with them. He has very little empathy. It's just a general lack of emotional development, because he himself was abused, abandoned, neglected as a kid. So then Lindsay Gibson talks about the 4 types of EIPs. There's the emotional parent, the driven parent, the passive parent, and the rejecting parent. And let me refer to my notes here. So the emotional parents are run by their feelings, like they're a slave to their out of control emotions that they have no idea how to address or not control but process in a healthy way. They're characterized by instability and unpredictability. They can be histrionic. They can rely on others to stabilize them. And that's definitely, both my father and my mother are like that. There's the driven parent that's compulsively goal-oriented, perfectionistic, controlling, and they try to run their children's lives. And that's definitely my mother. There's the passive parent who avoids dealing with anything upsetting. They take a back seat while a more dominant parent abuses and neglects. So that's where my father comes in. He just dipped out or checked out as a way to avoid having to confront my mother to protect us. And they ignore other people's pain. That's definitely my father. And then the rejecting parent who doesn't want to be bothered by their children. They have little to no tolerance for other people's needs. So all this comes down to is a lack of development in terms of emotional regulation and a lack of empathy, in a nutshell. And like I said, I really resonated with what she was saying in this book, and it really helped me to see the bigger picture of the whole family's dysfunction, not just how overt and explicit my mom's psychological and verbal abuse and tyrannical behavior was. That was obvious to see, but seeing everything as part of a bigger picture and seeing my dad as part of that picture, that took more time, and this book really helped to flesh that out for me in my mind, right? So she also talks about how children, and then, as the children grow up into adults, how we tend to cope or try to deal with this type of emotional neglect. And she talks about the healing fantasy, about how the child will eventually, it's a fantasy that you will eventually get what you always needed from your parent. If you do X, Y, and Z, if I achieve this, then mom will finally love me or accept me. Or if I do this, then my dad will finally get off my back. Or if I do this, then blah, 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 blah. And something that this author talks about, and that every single author of all the 4 books that I'm going to talk about as a part of this series, every single one of them mention how you need to let that shit go. The fantasy or the dream or the idea that your abusive parent will change or somehow become what you always needed as a child, it's just that. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy that is created within the environment of neglect and abuse, and you need to let it go. As you reach adulthood, you need to let that go, and you need to learn how to reparent yourself. And that's a common thread with all 4 of the books that I'm talking about too, and this author talks about it as well. Reparenting yourself, becoming your own parent. Is it fair? No. Is it fucked up that you had a fucked up childhood and that you're never going to know what having a normal, healthy childhood is like? Yes, and that is something you need to grieve. You need to release your repressed anger. You need to let out, in healthy ways, your rage. You need to process it. You need to process the trauma, and all 4 of these books talk about different ways of doing that. But the fantasy that your parents are going to magically become the healthy, emotionally responsive parents that you always needed, but they never in reality were, it's a fantasy you need to let go. They're not going to change. They're not going to change. Or at least the safest assumption for you to move forward with your life is to assume that they're not going to change. Because most of the time they don't. And that's a tough pill to swallow. Let me tell you, that takes a long time. I'm still processing that one. Lindsay Gibson in this book also has a whole chapter dedicated to the internalizing child. She talks about how children, and therefore the adult children of emotionally abusive or immature parents, how they have a tendency to react to the abuse and neglect in one of two ways. One is to externalize, which is to like become the bully, to dump your emotions on other people, to be angry and rageful and try to control and manipulate others. The other way, though, is to internalize, and I'm an internalizer, and so I found that chapter about the internalizing child very helpful. The internalizing child internalizes the parents' problems, and they believe that it's up to them to fix or change things. It's like you internalize, and you have that internal toxic critic, right? Your parents' abusive messages then become internalized into your own voice and your own identity and your own sense of self, right? So emotionally immature parents shut down internalizers' feelings with shame, contempt, and derision. So therefore internalizers are told their very nature is the problem. And I was told all the time that I was too emotional. I was shamed for having emotional needs, period. I was attacked and shamed by both of my parents. You know, some of my earliest memories are of my mother's contempt, feeling my mother's rejection of me, right? So the internalizing child learns to become invisible. You learn to become invisible, easy to neglect. You can develop codependent tendencies in your relationships, which is something that I've done, especially in my 20s. You can become a people pleaser. You can try to take on other people's responsibilities and burdens in an attempt to get them to like you because you're deathly afraid of being rejected the same way that your own parents rejected you, right? So then what do we do with all of this? And so Lindsay Gibson talks about the necessary breakdown and then awakening process to become your true self, right? Not your fantasy self that you developed as a kid as a coping mechanism to try in a desperate attempt to try to get your parents to understand and empathize with you. Now, this is your true independent self, independent of all the bullshit. She talks about the necessary emotional breakdown as a positive disintegration, like a positive breaking down, so that you can rebuild yourself from scratch. Well, not necessarily from scratch, but it's a rebuilding process. Like you are taking control of your individuation as an adult, right? She emphasizes waking up to anger, and I think most, if not all, the books that I'm going to talk about also mention this. The need to express repressed anger and how important that is for individuation. In a healthy way, of course. And they go into, in each of the books, some ideas and recommendations for how to do that, right? And to give yourself permission to have the freedom to have self-compassion, freedom to have your own genuine thoughts, feelings, desires, and wants, freedom to take action on your own behalf, freedom to express yourself, knowing that your goodness as a person isn't based on how much you give in relationships or your thoughts and feelings. And a quote that always stuck out to me because it always reminded me of my father, and I'll end the review of this book on this. She says on page 108, "Only emotionally phobic, emotionally immature people believe that wanting empathy and understanding is a sign of weakness." And like I was saying earlier, my father associates emotions and emotional needs and feelings in general with weakness, with irrationality. He thinks he has control over his emotions, but from the outside I can tell you he does not. And he polices other people in their expression of emotion because he sees other people's expression of emotions as a threat to himself. So I do highly recommend adult children of emotionally immature parents for people who are working through these childhood experiences of emotional neglect and possible abuse. It's a great starting point. The author writes very clearly. You can tell all of the authors that I talk about in all of these books, you can tell that they have experience as therapists because of how well they can break ideas down and make connections and how clearly the ideas are conveyed. It's really easily digestible and really, really helpful.